From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. One day, you might sit down with your grandkids and tell them stories of how you survived the summer of 2024, the year Colorado became a grasshopper hellscape. Grasshoppers are everywhere along Colorado's Front Range right now. They blanket the sidewalks and lawns, which makes them a pest. But they also devastate crops, which makes them a real problem for farmers. Our friends at the Colorado State University Extension run a sort of hotline for folks with questions about gardening and lawn care. They confirm that this is an extraordinary summer. They say grasshopper-related calls are up 600% in recent weeks as dozens of people call in with their hopper-related concerns. Kareem Garby is a horticulture expert and entomologist with CSU Extension. He's here to help us cope with and better understand this grasshopper-filled summer. Kareem, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about bugs.
I'm so glad you enjoy it. So let's start with the basics. Why are there so many grasshoppers this year?
The simple answer is climate change. We have a greater number of degree days. That just means a certain number of days over a certain temperature. So with climate change, grasshoppers are coming out of dormancy sooner and they're going to bed later. The same applies for their food. The plants that they eat are coming out of dormancy and going into hibernation later.
Okay, and just so I understand, when they hatch early, the plants and crops are not established enough yet to survive the onslaught. Is that how they are able to do so much damage?
So in the early spring, insect pressure can be a bigger problem because the younger plants can't really deal with all that feeding damage. Later in the season, it's usually not so much a problem, but the grasshoppers are just so numerous that even established plants can be overrun.
Well, judging from news reports, this is a problem across the American West this year. How widespread is the problem?
Yeah, throughout the American West, the USDA has put out like a grasshopper forecast, and us in Colorado, we're kind of in the eye of the storm. I know Pueblo is getting hit really hard, but multiple Midwestern states are also being affected by this.
Kareem, a lot of homeowners, myself included, are seeing our gardens get decimated by grasshoppers. What do these insects look for in a meal, and why do they pick on our gardens?
Grasshoppers' favorite foods are things that are soft and fleshy. So they love certain plants like zinnias, lettuce, beans, leeks, any kind of cereal crop. And then on other plants that they're attacking, they just like things that are soft and fleshy. They prefer to go after flowers and their petals. So they'll go after sunflower petals, rose petals, anything that, maybe we could eat too.
So what do you recommend using to get rid of grasshoppers?
So the best solution is to not give them their favorite foods. So don't plant those things that I mentioned. We also use something called a trap crop. So sometimes we will intentionally plant their favorite foods to help lure them or to consolidate them away from our other plants that we actually care about. There is also the option of using living organisms to control grasshoppers. Many things in the wild here naturally feed on grasshoppers, like some of our native birds, like the horned lark, even coyotes eat grasshoppers.
Wow.
For the backyard gardener is probably not going to buy a pack of coyotes, but there are organisms that they can use. So we often use microscopic organisms like fungi or nematodes that'll spread from grasshopper to grasshopper like a disease. We call these entomopathogenic organisms. That's just a fancy word for saying spreads from bug to bug like a disease.
Okay.
And some examples that we have, for nematodes, there are Steinernema and Heterorhabdites are ones that you can buy online. There are other fungi that will also go after grasshoppers and other organisms. They're called white muscadine or green muscadine diseases.
And in the meantime, we can look for nematodes on like wormazon.com.
Yeah, you can just look up, entomopathogenic nematodes in Google Shopping. A lot of garden centers and like farm supply companies nearby do have those nematodes on hand.
Are there insecticides that are safe to use?
Yeah, so insecticides are an option against grasshoppers. I typically only advise them if you've already tried the other measures that I've outlined and they have not worked. And if you are going to use insecticides, I would not advise using them in conjunction with those biological organisms because they're living things. Insecticides can hurt them as well. But if you are going to go the insecticide route, I would advise using insecticides in the pyrethrin class. These are all going to end in the phrase thrin, so cypermethrin, deltamethrin, permethrin. I say to use these insecticides because they have a shorter residual activity, so they're not going to stick around like forever chemicals and poison the soil for as long as some of these other chemicals. One more thing I wanted to add though, if you are going to use insecticides, I would recommend using insecticide-laced baits rather than a spray. Because a bait is going to attract grasshoppers to it and they're going to consume a small amount of it and die, so they're not going to get it all into the system. Whereas when you're spraying everywhere.
Okay.
And those are also available online, but these really only do well if you apply them in the early spring before the population balloons.
So it's too late now.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Kareem, as I mentioned earlier when we started this conversation, grasshopper infestations can be historic. I read this article in the Colorado Springs Gazette recently about the grasshoppers that overran Colorado in the late 1930s. The governor declared a state of emergency. People were using flamethrowers to fight the grasshoppers. How confidently would you recommend flamethrowers to fight grasshoppers?
I would say that the other measures that I've outlined are less injurious to the environment, less injurious to your wallet, and are probably a better long-term solution. Just like insecticides, you can spray or burn as much as you want, but if you don't address the conditions that are leading to the grasshoppers, you're going to be dealing with this issue forever.
I'm not going to lie, I'm disappointed. I kind of wanted to, have permission to hold a flamethrower. That's pretty badass.
I will say, though, a flamethrower can be useful. So a part of grasshopper control or any insect is getting rid of their alternative hosts, the other things they're feeding on while they're not assaulting your plants.
Okay.
So if you have lots of weeds, around your house or your property, and that's being a source of food for the grasshoppers, you can get rid of them either by hand pulling them or by using a flamethrower. People do use a weed torch to burn weeds, and that can get rid of their other food sources.
Well, on a serious note, when we talk about the impact this infestation has on farmers, we could be talking about tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars. Could you touch on how devastating this can be to crops?
Yes, so I know several farmers in Pueblo who are being hit hardest right now by the grasshoppers. Some of them are losing more than 50% of their crops. So grasshoppers can be, extremely injurious to farming operations, not just to backyard gardeners. And I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think this is an issue that's just going to get worse as the years go on. This is the worst year on record. Next year will probably be worse, or if not next year, the year after.
You talked to us a while back about miller moths. And while I still think they're a bit annoying, I still came away with more appreciation for moths after that. So help us see grasshoppers in a new light. Kareem, what's your favorite thing about them?
I love how grasshoppers lay their eggs. If you've never seen it, it's actually fascinating. The tip of their abdomen is very hard, and they can actually drill into the soil quite deep to lay their egg. If you live in Denver, I often see them laying their eggs into the cracks between the bike path in Cherry Creek. So if you have a lot of free time and you're interested, that's what I do in my free time.
Kareem Garby is with CSU Extension. Thank you so much for your insights today.
My pleasure, Erin.
And if you're sick of crunching grasshoppers beneath your feet, Kareem says, hang on. When the weather gets cooler in the fall and winter, those grasshoppers will go away, at least until next year. And that's it for us today on In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. We'll see you tomorrow.